So I'm here with Michael Meade, and it's the second time I've been honored to have him on the podcast. And so let me first begin just by welcoming you back, Michael. It's great to see you again and great to hear your voice.
Likewise, good to be with you, Brian.
Yeah, I got to say, you're one of the elders that I look to over the years when I'm feeling like I need some perspective on what's going on in the world, or I need to refocus in on what I think is important. And I'm just really grateful that you're still so active and you're doing a lot of stuff online now. And so to have this kind of access to you has been really helpful for me over the past, year and a half that we've been going through this pandemic together.
Yeah, it's necessary to be able to find meaningful conversations,
Yeah.
especially given the condition of the outside world, pandemic and beyond pandemic.
Yeah. And I guess what led me to reach out to you and your team this time was a bit of a synchronicity because I've been thinking a lot about initiation and rites of initiation, um, particularly around this pandemic and how it could possibly be an initiatory process for our global community and for us each personally. But also because I've been thinking about it in relation to this industry that's starting up around psychedelic therapy and how it's been quite medicalized. It's being done in clinics. And I've been really curious about how we could bring a ritual process into that therapy because I think that's part of what makes that kind of, um, you know, the plant medicines, what makes them effective is the ceremony around the actual ingestion of the medicine. So thinking about all this, going back to people like Robert Moore, who's done a lot of great writing and speaking about initiation, and in my inbox up popped this notification that you're going to be doing a workshop on initiation of self and soul. So I thought, well, this seems like a synchronicity. I got to check in with Michael and see, what he's planning for this and how he sees initiation as part of all this whole kind of global pandemic that we're going through. So maybe if you could start just by talking about how you defined true initiation, and if it takes more than just a kind of dramatic or intense experience to be an initiatory process.
Yeah, it's more than simple experience. So what I've been speaking about and writing about is that we're going through a collective rite of passage. And the reason I'm saying that is the classic elements of initiation, which is usually described as 3 steps, with the first step being separation, where a person feels separated from regular life, from their routines, from other people, whatever the separation might be. That's the beginning. And I'm suggesting that um, the archetype of initiation, to put it in psychological terms, is the dynamic of transformation. So that's a background idea. Whenever transformation is happening or required, the dynamic of it is the archetype of initiation. So first step is separation, which often has hints of death. And that can be things just feel like it's dying. It doesn't have to be literal death. And once the separation occurs, it moves into the second step, which is often seen as challenge, ordeal, suffering, descent, so that it isn't a movement upward into spirit to begin with. It's actually a descent into soul, you could say. And that's usually the most extended period. And the other idea that goes along with the second step of initiation for me is liminality. Limen being the Latin word for the bottom, the threshold of a doorway. So that initiation puts people betwixt and betwixt who they were and who they thought they were, and yet not yet at the place where they are becoming someone else. And I say that's happening to us collectively, that entire cultures now are betwixt what they used to be or thought they were, but not yet arrived at a place that can be defined or clearly stated. And then the third step is the return to a sense of community, which usually has with it the idea of a conscious recognition of what has changed. So that's one way to describe the three steps. And I think the separation is clear. The pandemic, the coronavirus has literally made people separate. It has made people isolated, and it has made death a subject throughout the world. In Western world, where death is not typically a subject, every day there's a count of how many people died. And so all the elements of separation and the beginning of initiation are there. And then suffering, challenge, ordeal, betwixt and between, descent, with descent being a key thing. So that most people experience the separation, went into a descent psychologically, which for most people can be overwhelming, especially if they don't understand how the psyche works, because soul likes descent. Soul thinks that we're intentionally going into the deeper areas to find aspects of ourselves that are not yet conscious. But since people don't know that, they think feeling isolated, feeling sad, feeling anxious, people think those are all bad things. But in the psyche, when seen as part of transformation, those are necessary things. And then the big problem in all consideration of rites of passage or initiation is the return. And I say that because almost all people 20 years or older have experienced separation, loss, some kind of descent, psychological turbulence, but hardly anyone has experienced a return to a meaningful, soulful community with a conscious recognition of changes that have occurred. So there's a big problem that is collectively what comes next. Most people think they want to go back. You hear people saying they want to go back to normal. That's because they don't understand that transformation means you go forward without knowing where you're going. Right. But people don't want to experience that, so they get nostalgic or desperate for something familiar. And initiation is about opening areas of the soul that are not familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of archetype of initiation, people like Mircea Eliade and Victor Turner spent a lot of time looking at different cultures around the world, and they're the ones who started to identify these three stages, along with Van Gennep even earlier. So the kind of questions that come up for me around looking at COVID, the pandemic, as an initiatory process and how it might fit into that archetype of initiation is really around the middle stage, that liminal period. And, one of the things that Robert Moore did to evolve the thinking of Turner and Eliade was pointing out the importance of ritual elder to create a container and help to move things forward, create a context for that ordeal and suffering and unknowing and confusion and all of the stuff that's part of liminality. And so that's where my question is, like, without the ritual elder to guide and to contain this middle stage, what are the chances that this actually will lead to a kind of communal initiation into a new way of being?
I'm not sure what the chances are, but I'll say something about where I think it's going and then come back to the difficulty you're naming. It doesn't require that everybody agree on the arrival. It's like in the individual psyche, not everything would transform at once. And so a person arrives at a completely new place with a deeper understanding, but it's not the same as understanding everything. And so I think in terms of collective rite of passage, everybody doesn't have to agree, and everybody doesn't even have to understand what's going on. A core proportion of people, and I don't know what proportion it is, are enough to shift the whole thing. That would be the theory. And so then, but to address what you were saying about the problem. So yeah, usually this is all considered a ritual. Ritual is the way humans have done it throughout human history. And one of the key things is, in order to go through a meaningful transformation, a person has to release their ego, in a sense, because it's also considered to be like a rebirth, that you go into a death and then a rebirth. That's what the descent is about. The death, seen psychologically, the death is the death of the ego. The ego doesn't want to transform. The ego wants to keep it the way it thinks it's protected. But the soul, which wants to transform, the soul wants us to transform continually. So initiation isn't a one-time thing. It just means to keep stepping into the road of transformation and expansion, deepening, growth, greater understanding. And so in ritual terms, there would be the elders or the guides, whoever's going to be guiding the ritual. And that's what allows a person to let go of their ego. In other words, you turn it over to someone that you trust or hope is that knows more than you do and is going to guide it in a good way. Mm-hmm. And that allows the ego to kind of die off or slip into the background, because the ego is in the way. The ego is literally our defense against being overwhelmed and annihilated. Mm-hmm. And in a ritual, you allow the ritual to take over. And so culturally, we don't have that. We really don't have that. The idea of the elder doesn't even exist in any meaningful way, because the elder, now this gets important in a way, the archetype of the elder doesn't mean an older person, right? Mm-hmm. The African proverb is, everyone gets old, not everyone gets elder, or white hair doesn't make the elder. So the elder is the awakened person who has learned from their own initiatory life experiences. So that's one issue. We don't have that collectively very much at all. But the other side of it is, psychologically, everyone has an inner elder, a sage in the heart. So when I use the title Initiations of Self and Soul, part of it is I want to talk about the psychological initiatory experience of awakening to a deep self within, which also could be called awakening to the sage in the heart, because that can happen without an outside ritual. The idea of people initiating themselves is a really dangerous idea that usually doesn't work. But psychologically, we could say that if a person learns that there's a deeper knowing self inside themselves, and that occurs as a real awakening, and then they commit to living in connection with that, that is an initiation on a psychological level. So I'm suggesting that there can be radical psychological changes and transformations without a clear collective ritual, because I think it's essential and it has to happen, and it's essential for the psyche. So in that sense, at least that's the term I'm using now. And then I use initiation of the soul as being more connected to the awakening of the inner genius and the aim of the soul that it had when it came into the world. And that has to do with unfolding from within the story that each person came to live, which is an initiatory story, in my understanding. So I'm just making those two distinctions because I'm with you. If there isn't some way for the collective to transform, then, where the hell are we going? Because nature is unsettled, if not in greater trouble than that, and culture is upside down. And so all the elements are there for transformation, but culturally we don't have either conscious rituals or the function of elders. So I think it has to have a psychological level, and then those individuals who awaken to the genius in their life, I just call it the genius, which means the spirit of their life, that gives them aim and purpose. And if enough people are moving on a path which has to do with their genius manifesting, then some of those people will be working in the realms of nature and helping nature find its vitality again. And some of those people will be working in the realm of culture. And by having a whole bunch of people doing that, they don't have to be coordinated per se. those changes can occur. That's how I'm thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of gets me thinking about something else that Robert Moore would talk about in his lectures back in the 90s. That, the way he viewed it was that we have been living in the age of the magician. So an age that's ruled by technology and those that have a mastery over technology. And I guess my kind of not so secret hope is that this time, if it truly is an initiation of the lover, the age of the lover, uh, bringing forth more of the qualities of appreciation for beauty and the natural world, putting more value on in-person, real-life community, um, things like that. So, what do you think if this is a global initiation? What do you think we might be initiating ourselves into? Do you have any ideas about the next age that might be opening up?
So I think what happens in the liminal phase is people get glimpses of what's trying to happen. People get visions that are actually messages from the future. Once you get into the liminal,
Hmm.
so what happens then is the present opens.
Yeah.
And when the present opens, it's like a river in a sense. You're in the river, only you can feel and see backwards, right? Ancient ideas, ancient understandings become more available, but at the same time, messages come from the future. So I think
Hmm.
those are both elements of the liminal. And I like the idea of connecting it to love. And then one way to expand that sense, um, it, I like the idea of soul a lot.
Yeah.
Soul is the third thing. You have uh, mind and body and soul. Soul is what connects mind and body. It's what connects spirit and matter. Soul is the connective tissue. And so when soul is present, then a lot of ideas in here. Let me back up a little bit. Each person has a unique soul. No one will ever live the life you're going to live, the life I'm here to live, or anyone paying attention to this is here to live. Hopefully, there's many, many more people with unique lives, but no one will live our unique life. So the uniqueness of the soul is a person's kind of secret connection to the origins of life, to the source of life, to the soul of the world. Because the old idea is nature only makes originals.
Hmm.
So you can have two cedar trees or a whole forest of them, but none of them are exactly the same. None of the birds or no two ravens are the same. No two humans are the same. That uniqueness is the secret connection to the source of life and to the soul of the world, I call it, to that which connects everything together. So initiation is really the awakening of that unique soulful self. But the other reason I look at soul is the old Greek word is eros, erotic. It means love, but it means love by connection. And
Hmm.
so the idea, in a sense, is the whole world is erotic. All aspects of the world are erotically connected to each other. So the more a person feels their own erotic presence and seeing erotic as not restricted to sexual or sensual, because there's the erotic connection to the beloved, to the transcendent, to the animals, all that kind of stuff, that would be part of the next era. If the present and the last era is a lot about dividing and separating subject and object, then it could be easily seen that the healing would require a reconnection on a soulful level, even on a molecular level, so that people began to more genuinely feel what is now being said, which is we are all connected. And so once you start to see that as maybe the path we're on, that helps explain social justice movement, Black Lives Matter. The pandemic then becomes a kind of obstacle with purpose, saying, don't you realize you're all breathing the same air? We're all inhaling and exhaling the same things. We are secretly connected. And now we have to learn that. And so in the old idea that obstacles are not to stop you, but to awaken you, then I think the COVID pandemic is an obstacle intended to awaken us to the fact that we're all together. And when something is sick over here, it's affecting everything. And that's a necessary understanding, not intellectually, but soulfully, molecularly, for people to then say, well, we could find and help shape a world where culture and nature are reconnected, where the individual and the global are connected, and where we're all connected. That would seem to be where it's going.
Mm. Well, I certainly hope so. And, like you said, this whole past 150, 200 years has all been about separating things out, very much that kind of magician process for analysis, and I think we've got a lot of that stuff covered, you know. And I take a lot of heart in thinking about the alchemical idea of the separating out is always followed by the bringing back together in the reforming of something new and something transformed. So I'm just hoping and trusting that this is part of a larger process like that. And like you said, the only next step is to come back together with new insights and new knowledge.
So one of the key things in the new knowledge is self-knowledge. I've been carrying this little phrase around. Normal cannot know itself. So when everybody says they want normal, they're talking about ignorance and not knowing. Normal cannot know, because normal is not essential enough, not awake enough to have knowledge in it. It might have comfort in it for some people, but it doesn't have genuine knowledge in it. And so, and that to me points back to the uniqueness of the individual. So in a sense, if we want more love in the world, that has to begin with a more genuine way of loving oneself. We can't give love that we don't have. I mean, this is one of the hardest things to realize. And that's why I say there's a psychological dynamic that's essential, because most people do not love themselves too much. And a lot of people don't trust themselves because they haven't got deep and down enough to find this deeper inner knowing self. And they're kind of stuck with the little self or the ego self. And so there's a psychological awakening that I think is part of the collective as well as the individual rite of passage. And you could say that all the hate that's in the world, it actually comes from self-loathing. Mm-hmm. So if you take someone who's radically homophobic, let's just say that, and the word homophobic literally means fear of humanity. Homophobic. Phobic is fear. Homo is actually a reference to human. Mm. So the source of hating someone in a homophobic way is fear of being human. And the fear of being human, it is, I'm afraid I might be that person, or I'm afraid that person can't understand me. And so somehow we have to get past that. And so there seems to me two radical understandings have to be present. One is there is a deeper self in me, and I can hear Robert Moore speaking, we work together, and I can hear his voice saying, stirring the great self within. That would be the phrase that he used in good Jungian style. and so one way to find more acceptance of oneself, more love of oneself, less anxiety about oneself, and less fear is to find this great self within, which is the natural inheritance of every human person. And then that leads to more love of oneself. But the other thing that's required in turn to have a meaningful acceptance and love of oneself is working through whatever the early life issues are, which usually go back to mom and dad and all the usual psychological things. Because even in traditional rites of passage and initiation, you could say two things are trying to be accomplished, especially in youth initiation, which would be universal throughout the world at one time. It existed as rituals. There were two things trying to happen. One, awaken each young person, girl or boy, to who they already are inside. Awaken them. Yes, they're someone's child, but that's only part of their life. Yes, they're a member of a tribe, but they're this deep self that is connected to the soul of the world, because tribal groups understood that each person was connected to nature. So that would be awakening of that. That would be part of the function of initiation of young people. But the second part would be to begin the healing in the life of that young person, because people living in tribal situations would actually know how the younger people are wounded. Imagine we're adults in a small tribe of people, and here comes so-and-so who's the child of this family. Well, we know the mom and dad, we know the grandmother, and we know what's going on in that family, because every family has its fate and every family has its psychological struggles, and no child ever gets completely what they need from their family. And so part of the process of the middle step of initiation is awakening to the deep self and beginning to heal the wounds that everybody carries. And so this idea of the healing the wounds part is essential to the loving part, I would say.
Yeah. I think, in my work with other people and in my own work, healing work over the past decade or so, where I'm at with it now is that awakening to the great self within, and I can hear Robert Moore's voice right now, the great self within, you know,
A little Texas accent.
yeah, that actually is essential to healing the wounds from childhood and the family and the culture and all of that real healing can't happen. Otherwise it's kind of like just symptom management, you know.
Yeah, there has to be. So I think of it as layers, and I think of it as descent, because it's going down deeper into the psyche. And one of the things about living in modern culture is quite superficial. Everything's connected, but it's horizontal. The internet, the World Wide Web is all horizontal. It lacks vertical imagination. It lacks a connection to spirit, which would be vertically up, and a connection to soul, which is vertically down. But usually the initiatory process goes down first, because the more soul a person has, the more spirit they can handle. The more depth a person has, the more the heights of excitement and spiritual movement can be used or be understood and can be present without doing damage.
Right,
And
like
so that going down.
the deeper the roots, the higher that oak tree can grow, something like that.
Exactly. And the more it can branch out and the more it can blossom and produce seeds. And oak trees produce thousands of acorns, and each acorn is a tree
Mm-hmm.
inside a shell. And so the old idea of the oak tree, the acorn, was the ancient theory for how each person was a unique self, because the one oak tree will produce thousands and over years. An oak tree will produce millions of acorns, and each one will grow into an acorn, but each one is different from the original tree. And so that was their image for how a human was unique but connected to the great tree of life. But you only an acorn can only grow when it's in the ground, when it falls from the tree and goes into the soil and into darkness and gets nourished by the darkness, and then it comes out as a tree. So descent was always the first meaningful step of transformation or initiatory change. So then if you imagine a kind of a system of going down, so first you have the ego, which likes to pretend it knows who we are and what we're doing, but it's really scared to death, especially now that the world is rattled and changing. So then when you drop down, you don't go right to the deep self. Everybody would just go there and we wouldn't even have this conversation.
We'd all be yogis in caves.
Yeah, or yogis dancing,
Yeah.
or all kinds of possibilities. But when you go down, what you hit is the wounded areas that the ego is trying to protect us from feeling, let's say. And so then you have to go down into those wounds, and kind of at the depth of the wounds, you find what I think of as an area of self-loathing, where I just can't stand myself because I know what I've done wrong, or I know how it feels to be bad, whatever it is. Everybody has their own arrangement. And then below that is the deep unifying self, which is also called the soul sometimes. The two words can be interchangeable. And so the idea is everybody's supposed to get, well, one old idea is everybody gets at least one experience of the inner unifying self, or they're not human. And it usually happens by the time you're about 20 years of age. It's such a forgotten idea that even though people have it, they overlook it or didn't fully get it. But it's there for everyone. And so, so the going down goes through the dark night of the soul, the night sea journey, where all the terrors and all the fears and all the anxieties and all the guilt and all the self-recrimination has to be experienced and become more conscious. And it's only tolerable if we understand that when we get to the bottom or the center, they're the same thing. When we get there, then we connect to this great self within, which then makes our individual story, our own life journey, our own rite of passage becomes more possible. So that when we leave from the descent, we're on the road we're supposed to be on. Because the soul, according to all the old cultures, the soul is aimed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but we can't find that aim. You can't find it casually. Most people don't know why they're alive. But once a person finds the cracking open of this acorn shell that fell from the tree of life, and it was inside each person, and when a person finds it and it cracks open, it's like, I get it. I know why I'm here. I have some sense of it. And that gives me aim and purpose and direction. And that's the initiatory path.
Mm. Yeah, it's the way you're kind of laying this out too. It's just such a great reflection of what's going on externally with the separation, the liminality, and the return. That's mirrored on this interior process that's happening where the ego's got to break off or die off or relax or get quiet for a while in order to realize that, ooh, there's something else here too. And then there needs to be a reconnection to it in a healthy way. That's like the ego is always listening for those prompts from the soul in order to follow the right path in life, because the soul knows, but we got to be really in contact with it and listening all the time. And sometimes the prompts are quite subtle and sometimes they're stronger, right? There's no denying you're just getting like shoved along your path and into scary places, right? So I love that how you're bringing that together, that what's happening in the world, looking at that as an initiatory process and calling that out so that people can actually pay attention to it and engage with it consciously, and also have some comfort that, okay, this time of liminality and confusion and all of that, that's not going to last. But we have to like do something about that return. We have to acknowledge what's happened and get a sense of how things want to be. And that's also happening for us each individually. And if it's happening individually, we're going to be able to support that communal process more. That's great.
So we've worked on, and I say we because I'm referring to Mosaic. That's the nonprofit we have. And it's also where we've done initiatory work for almost 40 years. We don't call it that in public because that can get tangled up in people's ideas and pretensions. But that's what we actually have been working on for about 40 years. And so part of that has led us to realize, all right, so in working with all kinds of people in retreats and conferences where we're doing deep work, I'll ask, how many people have had a separation experience? Hands go up. Sometimes two hands go up. People are saying, how many want to hear about? I was abandoned as a child, or I became an addict at 17. Everybody has their story of separation.
Mm.
How many have been through ordeals? Everybody's going, I have, So how many have been received after those experiences by a conscious, knowing community that understands what you've been through and understands what it means and what it takes to be reconnected to the sense of a collective, meaningful, human body. And you'll see very few hands go up
Mm.
because we're in that modern world, which everything is separated, and people have identified with ideologies and collective ideas like nations, parties, sports teams. All of those are substitutes for community. So we started to use the idea of sudden community. And that is to say, the people that you're working with at a given time, if there's enough honesty, enough genuineness, and a sense of trust, that becomes the community. And we call it sudden because it can convene all of a sudden because of a crisis or an opportunity. And then also sudden implies it's not going to remain. You get certain things done in a certain setting with people who are there together, and then life pulls people back apart because that is the part of the collective phase we're living through. So I hope that makes sense. And so
Yeah.
that means that, and that came about because we were working with all these young people who were going through life and death experiences all the time. And we could help them find, oh my goodness, I get it. I'm in this separated world. I'm not part of the community. I've been in prison. I've been an addict, whatever. And then they would go, yeah, it's been an ordeal ever since I was a kid. And we're working through that. And then they have to have a community that sees and accepts them. So whoever's present becomes the community for them. And we would form rituals around their pain, their transformation, and our own sudden temporary community. And I can say that that works to a degree.
Mm.
So if we're thinking in terms of the future, it's not as if we have to get a culturally cohesive, humanity. We just have to get groups of people who are awake individually and mutually connected, at least for a period of time, enough for each of us to find a kind of deeper sense of home and dwelling, and also a sense of blessing and confirmation, which is part of the healing process. So that's how I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're describing the sudden community, and I love that because it means that the opportunity for that is everywhere all the time. Like, where two of us gather, there I am kind of thing, right? And I'm
Yeah.
thinking about Victor Turner's idea of what else is essential in the second stage. And he talked about something he called communitas, which is this
Communitas.
communitas, yeah, where, like what you said, what's essential is that we leave our egos at the door, right? And it's like why everyone gets on their knees to go into the sweat lodge. It's like it's a great equalizer. And so that feeling of putting aside social roles and status and really finding a spirit of equality, that we're all in this together, that's really important. And that's one of the things that I'm struggling with in this time, is because I do see a lot of division, a lot of egos fighting each other, fighting other ideologies. And what I'm trying to do is to create sudden communities on the local level. Like what you said, just gather a small group of people together for a certain amount of time, have a nicely held container, or good enough container, the best that we can do or I can do as a very young elder of a kind. And I think that's where I'm kind of going with everything, is like really feet on the ground, local community, small groups, do what we can with what we've got in the current time. So
Yeah.
how have you, I mean, this has been a really restrictive time for a lot of us, but especially those who are used to teaching and leading groups and things like that. So how have you been trying to create those sudden communities in this time? Or is that something that can only happen when we're in person, do you think?
That's a really good question. I want to go back for a minute. I'll try to hold on to that question. So Victor Turner's work is really important. And he's the one that picks up the idea of liminality betwixt and between, and he marries it to communitas. So
Mhm.
these two things are like deeply related ideas. First of all, we get into the betwixt and between, and we don't know. We have to admit we don't know. this is the key to awakening. As long as we think we know, we're not changing. That's the ego is in charge.
Yeah.
Not knowing is the first requisite for going into therapy or for really entering initiation. I don't know. I want to be initiated to a greater sense of knowledge. And then Turner combines that with communitas. And that's an old Latin word. And community nowadays, for many people, would mean those who live near each other.
Yeah.
Well, that's that surface thing again. Communitas means something so deep happens, it pulls people together. So that's the first idea that I have about sudden community. It has to be something deep enough that people will let go of their egos and their angles and their fears and allow that deep sense of self to bring everybody together, but it has to be deep. And so I'm totally with you. Local is one part of it. Also, mutually focused. So when a person gets pulled onto what I call a genius path, they're going to be in search of and learning certain things. For some people, it's going to be into nature, and people are learning literally some forms of therapy or body work.
Mm-hmm.
And other people are learning, how to help people die, which is something coming back into awareness. And other people are going to be pulled into nature because that's where their genius goes. And they're going to be working with mycology and mushroom life, which is a big healing energy in the world waiting to be understood, and so on. And so it's in those areas of mutual interest where people are on similar roads. That's one of the places where you can form a certain community. So there are all kinds of groups going through experiences that are collective and individual where you can realize, wow, look at so-and-so, they're transforming, or we're all feeling a little bit of healing. And what's usually missing is a confidence in, a feeling for, and a trust in ritual. And so part of sudden community is you can turn almost anything meaningful into a ritual. But I want to underline meaningful. Mm-hmm. If people are bullshitting or they're in it for the ego, you mentioned the sweat lodge, one of the oldest rituals in North America, or actually it's universal because the Irish had it, their own version of it. Obviously Northern Europeans do, but so did the Siberians. And so the idea is you're going down on the earth, as you said, you have to let go of the idea that you know what you're doing and you're in charge. You have to go down. You also go into that heated container, which is the womb. So you're really going in and becoming an infant. And through the ritual process, you're getting some healing and some awakening. And then you're reborn when you come out of that sweat lodge. That's why you crawl out, is because you've just been born.
Yeah.
So that core idea.
I love that though. Just to pause there. Another Robert Mooreism, the tomb of the womb, pointing to this warm, dark enclosure where you go to die and be reborn. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the essence of all transformation and all initiation is dying and rebirth. So if you keep those things in mind, then anyone, well, let me also say this. There's what I call bone memory. There are memories in the bones that we inherit as being humans. And part of the bone memory system includes instincts for ritual. And so if people don't think of ritual as something that's prescribed, right, which I call fixed ceremony, like here's the way you do it and you have to do it this way, that's not a healing ceremony, typically speaking. Because even a sweat lodge, which may have a description and a process, but what actually happens in there is determined by the grandfather coals and the rocks that go in and the songs people sing. And really, it depends on how much honesty gets sweated out.
Yeah,
that's when the lodge becomes a real sweat lodge.
The confession's got to be spontaneous. Like you got to be on the edge of death and just crying out, right?
And that tells you the essence of sudden community.
Yeah.
So as soon as it starts to feel like someone's running an agenda, as soon as it starts to feel like people are pretending they know the outcome, then you're not in a ritual anymore. Well, you are in a ritual, but it's more like a fixed ceremony. I call it radical ritual. You might know step 1 and step 2, and after that, it's not determined. It's up to spirit. That's what they would say in Africa. You're trying to lure spirit in. And then if you know the outcome, it's kind of like, why go? If you know the score that's going to be there in the end, why go to the game? So there's this kind of requirement to trust something beyond ourselves, and we're back to the great self. We're back to the soul of the world. We're back to the healing level of nature. But everybody can figure those first two steps out. And the one thing I would caution about, it has to be genuine. It has to be authentic is a good word. And so if you're in it and something starts to sound off, I think there's a requirement to say, excuse me, I didn't understand that. That seemed, are you sure that's what you meant to say? Because it seemed, and then you have to.
Yeah. Or, yeah, I think for me, some good indicators are when it feels too neat and tidy, when it
Yeah.
feels scripted, like when the person leading the ritual it sounds like they're reciting a script, and it feels like it's not in congruence with what's actually happening in that space. So
Yes.
what I'm always thinking about, as I lead circles or facilitate them, because I'm not actually leading, but I'm helping to create the container in which that third element can enter and really work through us as, like, I think of it like becoming a hollow bone. So I try to leave my agenda, everything I think I know at the door. That's part of my ritual when I enter the space. Yeah. Anything about, do you think that there are some essentials to creating a good, solid container that can really open us up to that liminality and communitas?
I'll try and say something about that. I want to go back to the leader facilitator issue.
Yeah.
So we started out talking about the elder. You brought up the elder. So one of the jobs of the elders is to cut through the bullshit, right? In Africa, they have a saying that if a person can't curse you, then they can't bless you. And that means they can't be your
Mm.
elder,
Yeah.
right? You get a blessing from someone who can't hurt you. Yeah.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
has to be you're dealing with aspects of oneself and others that is so intense that it could cut right through you, but it's blessing you. Why? Because you're showing up authentically. So, and I get the idea about facilitating, and I understand why people are using that word even because it means less ego. But the trouble with, for me, with if it's just facilitating, the word facile is there. And facile
Easy.
can mean slippery and tricky and easy and facile. Yeah. So there are times when leadership is required. And I
Mhm.
would say this about therapy too, because therapy is very simple, similar to the steps of initiation. You bow your head to go
Yeah.
into a therapist and you say, something's wrong with me. I don't get it. Things are going wrong. I'm bowing down in hopes that you know better. That puts that person in a ritual leadership position as well. And they can't simply facilitate, or the person won't get the therapy they need. So there are moments. I've been in sweat lodges. I don't do sweat lodges much anymore. But when we were first working with at-risk youth, they were such a great, ritual to use. And some of us had worked with various native elders. In other words, we didn't take it off the internet. But there was so much conflict in the sweat lodges because people would come in with an agenda. And what's happening, I mean, we're in there with youth who could live or die the next day. It's really life and death circumstances. That's why we're doing it. And in many cases, we're multicultural. We have kids from gangs, adults from the hood. We have Native people. We also have Anglo people who are not parts of those things per se. And we're all in the same sweat lodge. And authenticity is the key. Like you say, it has to be real confession. The pain has to come out. And so I'd be in there like everybody else, trying to be human, but you do have responsibilities if you're part of the shaping the ritual, or as you're calling it, making the container. And if something rings false, we're in there with young people. This could be the difference between life and death for them.
Yeah.
I call it out.
Yeah.
That's I think where it does become like leadership, like saying, okay, we're just going to stop for a minute because we're in here, we're trying to deal with our own pain and each other's pain. We're trusting something greater than ourselves. And so if we get something in here that is too much of ourselves, then what could be medicine can get toxic. I just want to, before we go on, come back to you because you said this thing and it seemed a little like performance to me. And I know you didn't come here for that. And so you don't have to attack them. You just have to call to them in genuine and give a chance. You get what I'm saying?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I really feel that. And I use the term facilitating because, yeah, I guess it's feels less egoic, and it's just, I think, a matter of perception that we have with words. If I'm going to come out and say I'm going to lead this ritual, it doesn't maybe acknowledge how I feel inside, that I'm also being led in the leading of the ritual. So I just
Right.
use that term as a way to, like, I'm there to
No,
support the process, right? Not
no,
to
I
make,
totally get you.
yeah, I get you
Yeah.
too, but it's
But
got
I'm
me.
adding,
I like the nuance. I like the nuance, actually.
yeah,
And when I'm in that role, what I've gotten more and more comfortable with as I get older and more experienced and trusting the process more and trusting the third element that comes in. And if I'm truly a hollow bone, I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth a lot of times. And what'll happen is I hear trickster coming through me and, uh, you know, calling things out, usually with a little bit of humor, but sometimes with
yeah,
like kind of pushing people to really get down into the reality of their experience rather than just kind of tell a pretty story after, our shamanic journey or something,
yeah. No, we're saying the same thing. And
Yeah.
a person has to find their own style. So the first person I learned sweat lodge from, Native American elder, he was a totally funny guy. He was a hilarious guy. And so he always did it with humor. So someone comes in there who's, big chested and
Puffed up.
sings a big song and then says, I'm here to, to get blessed by the ancestors, whatever. And it's all pretense. And so then this native elder, his style would be to say, oh, okay, we have to stop for a minute. We'll need at least one more song because we hear what you're saying. Your wounds are so big that they come in here like a whole herd of buffaloes. Everybody's feeling like we're getting trampled by the wound you're bringing in. So we thank you for bringing the wound in. And now we're going to sing to you and hope that you'll start crying pretty soon so the rest of us can be present.
Wow.
And
Oh
then he'd lead
man.
a song or something. So what I mean by authentic is not pretentious at all, but a person has to come from who they are. And so I love that you brought in the trickster. For some people, it might be pretty direct. For some people, it would be humor. Because all the time you're trying to feel the alchemy of what's in there.
Yeah.
It's an alchemical heat process. The heat is needed to transform. And one reason people can't initiate themselves is because they can't regulate the heat.
Oh,
They'll either make it too cold or too hot.
yeah, that frog's never going to reach outside the pot and crank up the heat as it boils slowly, right? It's just going to be like in that lukewarm water, pretty content. It's like, yeah, this is hot enough. I'm transforming.
Yeah. So what happened to me actually early on, trying to learn, just being part of it, trying to be present, trying to be present with my own wounds, be compassionate to other people, whatever they're going through, all the things you do in there that are wonderful. But then something wasn't quite right, and we go out, and then afterwards, everybody's talking and saying, "Well, this was wrong," or "Did you hear that?" What I would say is, no, deal with it inside the sweat lodge. You can cook anything in there,
Mm.
because the danger is this: it's like pottery. Whatever you cook is what you're going to live with for the next 2 months, let's say. So if there's some bullshit in there or something not genuine in there, you're going to live with it for 2 months. And so so sometimes the person who's leading on that occasion, that's some groups I've been with say that, well, I'm leading today. So make it clear that I'm not like some great leader. That's not the point. But everybody has leadership in them.
Yeah.
And if those leadership moments don't become initiated and get confirmed, then we wind up back in culture where the wrong people are leading. Literally now, they elect the wrong people all the time.
Yeah.
And so those things need to be transformed and be blessed too. But anyway, I wasn't just accusing you of misusing the word. I'm really referring to something that's happening in the culture. And since modern Western cultures are ego driven, naturally anybody being genuine is doesn't want to be caught in that ego position. But there's something other than ego, which is, you started out talking about the elder. And when the elder is present, and I don't think the elder is a person, I think it's a condition. Just the way youth isn't a person, youth is a condition, so is the elder. And so that elder can come up in anybody that's sitting in the circle or sitting in the sweat lodge. And
Mm.
I've certainly heard someone who was in no way in a responsible position just go, excuse me, I was about to make my prayer, but I can't go on. What you said, I, I, I didn't feel it.
Yeah.
Can you help me? Can you say more so that when it comes to me, the doors are still open? I mean, I've heard people do that.
Mm.
And so that leadership doesn't mean you're in charge. That's the false presentation of it in the culture that we're all worried about. So anyway, I just wanted to pick that up because whether it's ritual or sudden community, conflict has to be dealt with at some point. If conflict can't be dealt with, it will never go deep enough. And you can't predict the conflict. And so there has to be this willingness to be in the heat, which is what the sweat lodge is, the literal ritual of putting everybody in the heat in order to melt the ego,
Yeah.
in order to melt the fixed attitude, in order to melt the defenses. And sometimes that melting needs a little guidance from whoever is feeling it the strongest or whoever is having a leadership moment. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. No, it really does. It really does. And I like that you pointed out that sometimes the leadership comes from, someone who's there as a participant. And I found that too. If I go in humble and open, really, I don't have to come with all of this like wisdom I want to impart or anything like that, because I trust that the wisdom's going to come out of the group. If I open up that space in a good way, everyone's going to feel comfortable enough to speak from the heart. And if they're doing that, they're all speaking from the same source that I'd be speaking from anyway. And it's been really amazing to me over the years to see that and then to trust that. It's also helped me like kind of relax my feelings around holding that role. It's like it's not all on my shoulders to bring the wisdom. If it was, we'd all be in trouble. But if I open it up in that communitas kind of way, where we're all on the same level, we all have, potential access to that same source, the eternal spring of wisdom that's bubbling around inside of us, that it's going to come out one way or the other.
Two tricky things. Someone has to set the container. You actually brought that idea up. That's taking on more responsibility than the others.
Yeah.
That's an aspect of leadership. Another thing I would say is if there's no vision, there's no leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So positional authority is irrelevant. So whoever's setting it up, this is coming from this old native elder I worked with. He said, the sweat lodge is the same every time. We always put the doorway here. We always put the fire in the middle. Everything's the same. He said, and you learn it really carefully when we do it this time, because it'll never be this way again. And everybody's going, what? And he was saying, it's the same, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
So then he was telling me, he said, you see and feel everybody coming in. Before people speak, you already felt them. You have an idea of what's there. And so then you might do your shaping a little different. Or for instance, if you go in a more African style, we don't know what song comes first, because Spirit's going to guide which song. And so you're in this position of, I know a little something, but I'm not presumptuous to know more than Spirit. And so I want to go back to the idea of in radical ritual, you know some of the steps, but you know that you don't know what's going to happen this time. And so in West Africa, for instance, they would say, now you're going to lure Spirit. And you can't lure Spirit by something that's fixed, because Spirit's not interested. If it's fixed, why bother to show up? So it has to have this open end. So I think the leadership issues, not egotistical, I'm in charge issues, but the sense, the smell, the feeling for how it gets set up this time, and really watching for what happens. I mean, if you really want to be there, and an owl comes through right while you're setting up in the daylight,
Yeah. And you ignore it.
Something's trying to be delivered.
Yeah.
And if someone comes in and you can feel that they're on the edge of anger, that is like another visitation, those things get picked up and they get worked in with the more familiar steps. So that's one part. And then the other part, I think, is when it feels like something's going wrong, because everybody will get cooked the wrong way. It'll affect everybody. And so, I mean, I've been in a sweat lodge where there were two native leaders from two different traditions, and they actually had a spirit fight inside the sweat lodge.
Mm.
And we had brought in all these gang kids who were having their first experience and were taking a radical risk. I don't mean just the risk of getting hot, because the sweat lodge was in a neighborhood that was so dangerous for them. We had to come in at night with cars with no headlights.
Wow.
Because if anybody gets seen, they'd be shot on sight. But that's where the sweat lodge was. And so they have risked their life to get there. And then inside the sweat lodge, something that is not authentic is going on. You can't do that. They've been betrayed by culture their whole lives. You can't betray them again. So something has to stop that process. And it doesn't have to be brutal or arrogant. It's, excuse me, I think something's feeling like the wrong kind of tension in here. And then, so that has a little bit of a leadership quality in the sense that you're going to take the step in.
Yeah.
Which is also the definition of initiation.
Yeah.
Take a
Yeah. And I think you need to have been cooked long enough in your own alchemical fires to not be afraid to turn up the heat a little bit, right?
Yes. Which is literally the job of the person calling at the door, facilitating the sweat lodge.
Another grandfather, not hot enough yet.
And so then you just see the grandfathers as happening on more than one level.
Yeah.
So the psychological grandfathers that have to be called in. And someone might do that with humor, and someone else might say, I know that there are young people in this sweat lodge who could die tonight or die tomorrow because they're on the edge of life and death. And so I feel strongly that whatever we do in here has to be authentic so they can have an authentic experience of their own soul and their own spirit. Can we agree to that? You know, and if you say that at the right time and you pick your tone based on what's going on, then that's often enough. It doesn't have to be corrective. It could be going back to the idea we're all in this together, but could we agree right now that we want to be authentically here, painfully here, because we could be sacrificing a young person.
Well, thanks for all that. It's really helpful to me as someone who's, stepped into that role, kind of, I don't know, hesitant leader, because I haven't always had elders around to consult with, or to observe and let me know how I'm doing. So I got to trust the spirit a lot, and, listen to people afterwards to see if it actually had some impact in their life, right? And then adjust accordingly. But it's hard without that guidance, I got to say.
Yeah. So what we do, part of the Mosaic process and the Southern Community process, is afterwards we have a very serious review, which can almost be as heated as a sweat lodge in the sense that we go right into it. And so let's say I was the leader of part of what was going on, then I will know what the tricky moments were, what the contentious moments were. And I'll ask, how did I do? Did I handle that right? Did I bring the right energy to it? Did it help the changing, transforming quality? And everybody else has something to say too. And so then everybody's going through a real reflective process so that we're all learning and we're all getting more confirmation for how to do things. Because if at the beginning we were talking about the elder, and I was talking about the collective rite of passage. So let's say that we're lucky, and let's say that we're courageous, and let's say that we get a lot of help from spirit and the animals and the soul of the world, and we find a way towards a new cultural agreement, a new style, a new way of being together, and it is improved and it has healing in it, but it's not going to include everybody. It won't happen that way. There are people who will not let go because they're afraid to whatever. So what happens when we run into them? And if we don't have enough strength to figure out, because eventually what happens is the outside becomes the sweat lodge. Really, any almost moment in life can be opened up for knowledge and insight, but it also can open on its own. Like nowadays, look at all the arguments over masks and all that kind of stuff. There's so much tension, so much opposition, so much unaimed fire in the air.
Yeah.
And if you become a change agent, you're going to run into people that instinctively are afraid of you. And when people are afraid, they attack. And so, I mean, I've been in a number of situations where the ritual became under attack.
Hmm.
And so if you think of the container as a safe place, like a sweat lodge, and then someone attacks it, and you're responsible to some degree, you have to be able to fend off that attack. I've been there.
Yeah.
And you have to have, and like you're saying, you don't want to then become your adversary. You don't become violent or attacking. You have to have moves. And some of them have to be trickster moves if it involves authorities like police. And some of it have to be more sincerity, or you have to know in the moment what to do. I've been there a number of times. And so that's another thing to learn too. And then that's preparation for then taking deep, meaningful things, ritual knowledge, esoteric ideas back into culture. But when the attack comes, you have some experience in how to still keep protecting
Yeah.
the essence and the sacredness and the people.
Yeah. I like that. You got to have a few different moves. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you got to like
Yeah.
really stand your ground and be quite firm, bring some of that, Saturn Senex energy, like conjure up the inner elder. And that's the hardest thing for me. I'm pretty good with like the trickster and, open heart conversation to find connection. But that's the hardest thing for me to access really is that confrontational mode. So this is actually something that comes to mind to ask you about. So when we're out in the world and we're kind of seeing all these opportunities for transformation in the world because there's a lot of conflict, we're rubbing up against each other now and boundaries and all of that. And there's real opportunity for awakening and eye-opening and connection on a deeper level. But often it might involve confrontation. And so as someone who is like conflict adverse because of my own childhood wounds, um, that's something I often, and I've been sitting with it more and thinking about, I used to think like, okay, in order to grow, you got to like face every confrontation that's made available to you. Like the universe is bringing you this person so that you can confront them and gather up that strength and courage to do it. And that's how you need to heal and grow. And lately, though, I've been thinking more about like energy management, especially as I age, and thinking that maybe the best way now is to actually um, cultivate discernment about which conflict is worthwhile confronting and which ones aren't. And that's a hard thing for me sometimes, because I want to make sure that I'm not just backing down because that's kind of my avoidance of conflict happening, or if it's really, this is not quite worth it. This is just going to drain my energy, and I need that energy for all the things that I want to fight for, rather than spending it fighting against something. You follow?
Yeah.
So I wonder,
It's
like,
like,
if you have any guidance around that, like how to know like which battles to take on.
no, I think it's a really good question. I mean, the whole internet needs to learn that, really. There's talk about waste of energy. There's huge amounts of energy, human energy, that could go into healing that's being wasted on mindless mutual wounding.
Yeah.
So that's another signal of how far things have gone out of balance. So what it made me think of is where I've learned, I grew up kind of rough New York neighborhood where you did have to be able to defend yourself in a moment, in a situation that had no meaning except you want to survive it. That was common. And so that's not the best training ground. So it has been a training for me to understand what is worthwhile standing up for.
Hmm.
And so um, I think one way that I look at it is if I'm even close to the path I'm supposed to be on, because it's going to be a way of growing and learning and giving for me, then I'm more likely to make that distinction quickly. Like things that used to be public things that could be quite challenging to me, or where I would want to correct something, or it doesn't happen as much now. And what I really learned is in doing these kind of sudden community events and ritual events where people have trusted the situation and they're now vulnerable, and some energy from within the group or without the group is now endangering them and me too, then those are places I know, no, I have to make a move here, and I have to trust myself and trust the unseen is going to give me some knowledge. That's been a huge learning for me. We were doing a ritual once back in during the first Gulf War. It was a grief walk with several thousand people in Washington, D.C. at night, beginning in the evening, going into the night. And our goal was to go to the Vietnam Memorial Wall and have this grief ritual for all of the wars. And we didn't know that there's a federal law against any ritual behavior at the Vietnam Memorial Wall.
Wow.
So here we are coming down through the streets of DC, 2,000 to 3,000 people, each carrying a candle, and we're all singing a chant, which, you know, I had taught to everybody. And we run into a whole bunch of police motorcycles, and they say, "You can't come here. It's not allowed." I said, "What's not allowed?" "No ritual whatsoever. You can't bring candles." And so I don't know what to do. The New York parts of me wants to argue and fight. Another part of me wants to run as fast as I can and get out of there because I'm at the front of this thing. But something in me said, okay. And so I just turned to people and said, blow out the candles. Because he had said, you can't bring candles. So we blew out the candles. And people are still singing. And this is all happening in this kind of intense huddle with cops. And they're saying, singing and chanting is against the federal law.
Jeez.
And so I turned around and I said, tell everybody to start humming. And so, and the guys watching me, these cops are watching me, and they're going, this is pretty interesting. And I said, can we go ahead now? He said, no, there's a federal law. Everybody can only go single file. There's no crowds allowed here. I just turned around and say, everybody go single file. And I'm looking at them and I'm saying, what's next? Keep giving us a rule. And finally they said, man, okay, go ahead. And so what happened is, as people came down into the wall area, they stopped humming. And the candles got blown out and everything went dark. And then as you come out the other side, I just said that the first couple of people start lighting the candles when they come out and turn the song back on. And so anybody watching would see thousands of people go, and the lights going out, and it's going out, and the Vietnam Wall is down. It's a descent thing that was really brilliant by the woman who created it. And so it's all going into darkness, and all you hear is humming of a couple of thousand people, and then the light comes back on, and everybody's coming out, and the song's getting bigger, and now the cops are there waiting with their motorcycles, and the leaders of the cops said to me, where do you want to go now?
Wow.
And they said, point a direction, we'll lead the way. And so there was a hill, and they took their motorcycles, and they became the front of the ritual, and we got up on the hill, and we sang up there, and the cops joined in, and I learned from things like that.
Oh,
I
man.
I have like Irish temperament, so I can get involved and embroiled in things, but you don't want to ruin such a beautiful thing that was trying to happen.
And I mean, that cop couldn't have designed the ritual more elegantly. You know, he made the ritual better. And because you didn't get into that confrontation mode, it was more of like, your move was more like a jujitsu move. Like, okay, this is where the leverage is. Oh, okay, I'll move with it. What next?
Yeah.
What next? And then he told you how to do the ritual better. Like, that is just the perfect example of being in that space of leader, not leader, right?
Yeah, and the idea, what happened to me was, I felt if there wasn't public grief at the time when bombs are being dropped for reasons that are going to turn out to be misleading, blah, 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 and if there isn't grief for that on the part of the people who are enabling it, in a sense, then even more damage is being done. And so I just kept that. That's where my imagination and even my will was,
Yeah.
that
So
we're
that,
going to do a ritual. We're
yeah,
going to do a ritual.
no matter what. And so that's the vision that you're talking about. That's a requirement of the ritual leader, to have that vision and to be in service to the higher value, whatever that
Yeah.
is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then honestly, you want to have people with you where you can turn and say, is this making sense? Or am I losing my mind? But because remember, at the essence of it is transformation.
Yeah.
So you can transform in almost any circumstance if you're tuned in and whatever else, and once it becomes literally dangerous, then that's something else. Then that's a different kind of, it's actually a different kind of ritual, believe it or not.
Hmm.
But so yeah, so I think whatever we're trying to learn now in this liminal period, which is also the experiment with communitas period, is going to be tested on the way back, on the way forward, which is also, it's the way forward, but it's the way back to human community. And it's going to be tested, just as we see how rigid and how angry and how revengeful and how many people are caught up in hate and revenge, and that stuff's going to get encountered at certain along the way.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of radical learning that I think is so I think it has to do with bone memory and trusting, not that we know where the ritual is going, but we know where it could go, and then leaving room, as you said, for spirit to come in and guide as well. And so, there was some guidance from unseen forces on that day also,
Oh yeah.
and we
So
actually got to do the whole thing that was completely illegal. It was against federal law. It was brilliant, and afterwards, it. People at the way back of this procession had no idea what happened up front. They thought
right.
this was the plan. They thought, you could hear people say, that was so great. The way, everything
The
went dark
descent
and we
into
were all,
darkness and yeah,
100%.
silence.
You're going, yeah, it's a good plan. So, because that's the other thing about ritual, and that's true of a sweat lodge or any kind of healing event. No one sees all of it. There's too much actually happening. By the time it's really happening, there's too many things happening and no one sees all of it. But it does remind me of an old tribal thing, which is the ritual isn't over until it's been talked about.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean chatted about. That means going back over the deep parts and so on.
Hmm.
But this is all in the bones, I think. So it's
Yeah.
waiting to get remembered, so to speak.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When you're doing that, the only word I can think to use, and I don't know if there's some black humor in this, but the post mortem after the
Yeah.
ritual, just thinking that
Yeah.
anyway, death is part of every ritual, so it's kind of a post mortem. But when you're doing that, are you doing that with kind of participants, or do you have some people who are apprenticing with you, who you're consulting with? Is it open to everyone to provide feedback, or what?
It depends. I mean, sometimes we actually have to do the postmortem in the middle. I mean, to be honest, sometimes, especially if you have really diverse people present, issues that come up that no one knows anything what to do about it. And so then we go into that process in the middle. And then everybody can contribute to that. So I think what we wound up doing ourselves in retreats, where we're usually like 100 people, is we're doing postmortems along the way. Like we do little rituals. We're aiming maybe towards a big ritual, but we do little rituals to get present, to get connected to the nature that's there, to allow conflict to come out. And then we'll do a review of those, which includes more and more people involved having insights and getting a better understanding of what we are there for. But often the bigger ritual, because of modern circumstances, sudden community, people have flights to catch, people, and so that usually then that time is spent by the core group of people. I
Yeah.
mean, if someone else is present, that's fine, but usually there's a core group of people who have planned to be present afterwards. And then the review, because it really means to keep viewing it. It's
Mhm.
not over. It actually lives on with people, and so it'll go on over the telephone and so on. And then when we get together for another event, we'll actually be reviewing previous events, because it actually, the Native American phrase I like is, that ritual made me. And they mean that made me a different person. And so that needs to be discussed and needs to be shared.
Hmm.
So I think there's more than one level of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So much good stuff in this conversation. I knew you wouldn't disappoint me, Michael. I come and I try to come in that hollow bone mode where I don't really have an agenda. Some stuff has been kind of clunking around in my head for a while, and you really helped bring some things into focus. And we got into areas that I didn't expect, which I think is a good sign that there was that openness and trusting in where this conversation wanted to go. So I want to thank you for that. And maybe you could just take a moment to, well, first of all, I'm curious about what's happening at Mosaic. I know you're doing a lot of outreach through the internet now. You've got the podcast, you're doing these live streams. I participated in a solstice ritual with you, which was really fun. Um, what's happening with Mosaic in terms of on the ground outreach, like doing these initiation, not initiation rituals? Are you guys still involved in that?
Well, we're on our way back to it, but we're not in a hurry.
Yeah.
And so uh, one of the things you were asking before we went into that last area of conversation, does it have to be in person? Can it happen online? It turns out more can happen online than I would have thought.
Hmm.
I've been surprised by that. And like when we did that solstice ritual, and then we kind of finished the parts that we were doing that we knew we were doing. And then we were doing our review afterwards. I'm looking at Corin. We were doing our review afterwards, and it was still on the screen, and like hundreds of people are still there. It's over, but you can see the shrines and everything. And so we wound up realizing, oh, wait a minute, this is going to continue. I don't know how long it went on for. It went on for hours and hours and hours, whereas people used the shrines that were really video representations on the screen, and they sat as if they were in a shrine. And so there's all kinds of things to be learned. And I don't know how much more can be done online. So there's that. And then what we're doing is we're not in a rush to go back, because the things that we like to do the most are so deep and personal that we don't want to be interrupted by concerns about vaccination. And we want to make sure that we can all actually be in a deep, intimate, personal space together before we start doing it again.
Hmm.
But we're all missing it too.
Yeah. As part of Mosaic's work, are you doing any trainings for ritual leadership and initiation?
Well, not per se. So what we're doing is, in about a month or so, we're starting a series of online mentoring workshops. And so what I want to do is use the idea of mentoring as a middle ground.
Mm-hmm.
So the mentor is between the youth and the elder.
Yeah.
I found this tribe in Africa that calls what we would call mentoring, they call practice eldering. They call the practice
yeah.
elder.
I've been calling myself elder in training because I know eldership is down the road for sure, but I'm in training. I'm paying attention. I'm trying to learn.
Yeah. So, and I use the term a self in training, like our self is trying to use everything that happens as part of our training. So I decided to use mentoring as a middle ground where we can look at psychological things, initiatory things, aspects of youth, because the youth continues to live in the elder. The elder without the youth is just an old person. So part of the idea of the elder is the youthful qualities and the youthful dreams are still alive. But then again, I found an African tribe where they said when we initiate young people, we're awakening the elder in them.
Mm.
So mentoring seems to me to be a ground where we can look towards the elder,
Yeah.
look towards the youth, look towards the psychological, look towards the cultural, look towards the ritual. So it's a series of online workshops. So it'll involve, it's a response to people asking for training, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's
Or
one thing we're going to.
yeah. Like give me some guidance. I want to step up and be of service to my local community, but I don't have a local elder to learn from. And I love that the way that mentor has both the younger and the elder in them. Um, Part of the way I think about myself being 46 years old, I was a young man in the 90s when you were doing all the men's movement with Robert Bly and Robert Moore and James Hillman and all those guys. Um, so I see myself as very much like kind of a bridge generation right now because I think I'm still young enough to kind of get the younger generations to understand what they're, the internet came along when I was in my late teens, right? So I've kind of got a bit of both worlds in there, and I'm old enough that I can relate to or understand what some of the older teachers are talking about or talked about when they were alive, and I can kind of help translate in a way. And so
Mhm.
I love that. So that would be the role of the mentor, is to be a
Yeah,
bridge. Yeah,
yeah, it's a middle ground.
yeah.
And I should mention, and you mentioned it early on. So, but the next online workshop is initiations of self and soul. Just because I think the imagination of initiation is critical. I think it's what's actually happening, culture wide, collectively, and so I'm going to be addressing that, and that's really the beginning of this series that could be seen partially as training, and then those things are going to be added to things that we're developing where there's written material, audio material, and unpublished material that addresses each of the themes, some of which we've been talking about. So Mosaic is now working that way. Um, I love working hands-on, and for decades, everything else would be put to the side to get to those hands-on experiences because we could feel ourselves transforming and we could see and feel other people. And there's just something so beautiful and meaningful about that. And it's like, when you're in that, even if you're taking a responsibility role, you're getting the benefit just like everybody else. That's
Oh
the way it's
yeah,
supposed to.
yeah.
But because we had this interruption, we're realizing that getting some of this stuff documented and collected has a value also. So we're going to stick with that for a while and have things that people can find online, but also group the already written, unpublished stuff as well. And we have a whole archive of audio, and we're organizing it into themes so people can use it in their own time and at their own rate. So that's where Mosaic is focused now.
That's great. And I know what you mean about, I'm really all about the in-person experience too. Like that's when I really come alive. That's when I'm more eloquent than I am over this medium. I find this really difficult and I'm getting better at it. I've been doing it 3 years, these conversations, and I'm just starting to get better. It doesn't come naturally to me. You were born with the gift of the gab. Me, I'm born with the gift of intuition and feeling. The expression of that has always been real hard for me. But when I'm in the group and I'm a hollow bone, the words come through. And I really love that. And I get, the energy back from the group. Online, it feels like it's a lot of output. It's hard to get a little something back, and that's exhausting.
So think of it as a different ritual. I'm looking at Corin again because we've been going through this together. And we first started doing stuff online. I mean, the last thing I'm going to do is do something that I think is meaningful online. Let's get, if nothing else, get an audience, but better yet, let's get a retreat group. And so one of the first things I noticed is you're putting out and not getting back. I mean, in a conversation, you get a little bit something back, but if you're presenting something online, it was really shocking. It was like, I felt isolated afterwards. I felt
Yeah.
literally more isolated. And we started to work on what's going on, what are the psychological elements. And one way to see it, it's a very different ritual. I'm still learning about it, but I have learned the idea is you put it out without knowing who's going to see it or hear it. And so it's just a matter of trusting in that. And then there is this odd feeling afterwards, like something was missing. We were really close to really meaningful things that are somewhat familiar. And now I call it lights on, lights off, the lights go off, everybody's on their own. And I'm usually looking for, I don't know, where do
A
I
hug
go?
or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I feel like going with the animals somewhere.
Oh,
But
I feel you, man. It's like
yeah, so that's the
it's an
thing.
amplification of what normally happens after a circle, a ritual, or something. Everyone's left. They're flying high. They're like floating out the door, and you're up there sweeping all of the all the dust and junk that
It is like that. Only
like
it's
from
more isolating yet.
yeah. And then you're just sitting there looking at this screen and going, okay, I guess I'll go do the dishes now.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the ways that makes it maybe easier for you is you've got so much great support on your side, and even now you're not alone in that room speaking to my image, And so I just want to express a lot of gratitude to the Mosaic team that does a lot of amazing work behind the scenes. And I know just as someone like me who sends out the invitation on email, what comes back is different. Every person, how it comes back is different, but your team has always been like really prompt, really organized, really helpful. And all of the stuff I've done with you online has just, the production, the way you guys set up even the backgrounds is amazing. And I know you got a lot of help there. So I just want to acknowledge that and express my gratitude.
Yeah. And particularly corn.
Yeah.
Corn's a part of each element that you mentioned. So yeah.
Right.
And that's part of it is it. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
need to
I'm
support our
echoing what you're saying.
elders. We need to support our elders. We need to like make sure they're got their comfortable camp chair around the fire, and they got their hot drinks or the hot toddy, whatever. Right? We got to take care of our elders. So thanks,
I'll
Corn.
remind them of that. I'll remind them of that.
And a little back rub, Corn. Come on.
Yeah. All right.
Well, Michael, thanks again, and I'll
Yeah.
include links for everything that's coming up for you, and
Great.
I'll be joining you for some of that for sure. Thanks.
All right. Great to see you. Great to talk, Brian.
Take care.
All right. Keep up the good work. See you out there someday. See you up on Vancouver Island someday.